Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us here for the Agroforestry in Action webinar series. Our guest today, John Fike, will be giving a presentation about silvopasture research and outreach in Virginia. Today's presentation will run about 40 or 45 minutes, followed by some question and answer discussion period. Today's presentation will be recorded and will then be posted on our website, the Center for Agroforestry website, for on-demand viewing. And you can find information about all previous presentations in the Agroforestry in Action webinar series on the Center for Agroforestry website. Again, my name is Gregory Ormsby-Maury. I'm the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. Our guest today, John Fike, is an associate professor in the Department of Crop and Soil Environmental Sciences at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. He's also a forage extension specialist and has produced numerous extension guides and research publications. His areas of interest include forage and livestock systems, hemp, and bioenergy crop research. He completed his doctoral degree at the University of Florida, doing research on ruminant nutrition, and received a Master of Science in Forage Agronomy at Virginia Tech. So please, let's welcome Dr. John Fike for today's presentation. John?
Thank you, Greg, and greetings to you, audience, from snowy Virginia. I appreciate the invitation from the Missouri Agroforestry Center to speak about silvopasture efforts in Virginia. And although I'm the headliner today, I want to be clear that the things I have to show are the results of many people's efforts. Let's see if I can, just lost my shift there. So to frame today's conversation on silvopastures, I thought I should consider the activity in a general sense, at least in the Southeast, and then I'll discuss Virginia's efforts in terms of our team approach and some of the attitudes of landowners and producers and agents, and the agent training and research and demonstration efforts that we have ongoing. And then I'd like to cap my presentation with a quick overview of the producers and their motivations. So to start, again, framing the situation, I'm sure many of you recognize that agroforestry adoption is quite low in the United States. And these numbers on utilization in the Southeast U.S. come from the National Census of Agriculture from 2012. And they represent the number of farms using either alley cropping or silvopasture. And excuse me, the percent utilization ranges from 0.08 in Tennessee to 0.29 in Florida, and the average across the region is about 0.18. So that's obviously quite limited, and despite all the warm fuzzies that I or others might feel about agroforestry, we really need to ask why, come on, click here, why isn't agroforestry or silvopasture more common? And I think this really reflects a lack of several things. First, I think we might face a language barrier. Producers generally don't know or recognize our terms. In some cases, when we've begun working on silvopastures in Virginia, we've met producers who've said, I've been doing that, I just didn't know that's what you called it. We also need more visible research and demonstration sites. Producers want to see and feel these systems in operation, and they really have few examples to turn to. Extension programming and guidelines for adoption also have been limited. Extension outputs typically have reflected university research efforts, and if the university is not doing the research, then there's not going to be the corresponding extension information to go along with that. Finally, we should not underestimate the power of social influence. Producers are generally pretty conservative by nature, and it can be pretty difficult for them to step outside the bounds of their ordinary practices. They may feel it causes them to lose standing within the community. There's also just the simple, straight out economic risk for doing something new that you're not really familiar with. And even if those things aren't problems in terms of, your position within the community, that sort of thing, it can be difficult to find others who can share experiences and serve as mentors for people who want to be engaged in agroforestry practices. Along with these limitations, agroforestry practices face some institutional and cultural resistance. And I think this is deeply ingrained from long-held positions about how land should be managed. The institutional culture of foresters and natural resource conservationists has been to preach, keep the animals out of the woods, and that has been true for at least 3 generations. For farmers, this memory and culture is actually longer because they often talk about how they and their families have been removing trees since the time that they came to that land, wherever that may be. So in both cases, agricultural and forestry producers often are stuck in an existing paradigm where simplicity and management ease are highly desired. And that brings me to what I call agroforestry's implementation paradox. And that is diversity and complexity, which are the features that create the benefits of agroforestry, are also the same attributes that challenge land managers and limit adoption. This is a difficult thing for them to do, given, again, because of the complexity, and they want to make things as simple as possible in many cases. So that's our backdrop. Let's see here. That's our backdrop, and it brings me to Virginia's efforts with silvopastures and agroforestry more generally. We have a diverse group of people engaged with silvopasture and agroforestry research and demonstration and outreach, and our team represents faculty from a couple of different universities, along with their graduate students and collaborators at NRCS, the Forest Service, and we have a number of extension agents from counties across the state who are also working with us on agroforestry and silvopasture research and demonstration. So in Virginia, we have largely prioritized our efforts to 3 agroforestry practices, and that would be forest farming, riparian buffer strips, and in the riparian buffer strips, we don't think about that as just planting and walking away. We think about that as planting something that can be used to produce other crops, goods, as well as services. And then, of course, silvopasture. And an important part of this overall effort has been working to understand our audiences. We've gotten support from Virginia's Department of Forestry and other sources to study landowners and to determine, who might adopt agroforestry practices. And this effort was largely led by Dr. John Munsell in the Department of Forestry on campus. And it showed that landowner interest is affected by a number of factors, from social influence to risk expectancy, their level of experience, how many acres they have, etc. And the interest is greater, interestingly enough, among newer owners who have higher incomes or who may be less active in farming. And that may be telling, I suppose. But I've got a producer that I think kind of fits this situation. We'll discuss him later on. Another issue for existing producers is that they are kinesthetic learners, and I think we have a better chance of changing their attitudes by creating demonstration sites, because that kind of hand-on experience is really critical for their education and understanding. So along with the landowner efforts, we've conducted additional surveys of ag agents in the Southeast and of limited resource farmers in Virginia. And we've done that to better understand these different constituencies. And first, I've got 3 figures here, and I want to lay these out. The dark and light blue sections in each of these figures represents the responses of strongly disagree and disagree. The cream color represents neither disagree nor agree, and the light red and red represent agree and strongly agree. So let's see if I can get this pointer here and move it around. And so when we look at their opinions, let's look here at the top right. Agents and farmers both saw that generally were positive in their responses to silvopasture as a mechanism for improving water quality. Interestingly enough, they were less certain about the benefits for carbon sequestration, but if you look at their thoughts on livestock as a source of greenhouse gases, you see that they were much less likely to agree that livestock even were contributors to greenhouse gases. So, those two pieces probably fit hand in hand. However, they were all, or both groups were had high levels of agreement that trees can benefit agricultural system biodiversity. Now, when we look at agent responses to management questions, you see that they seem to have a lot of questions about management. If we look at this top right, I lost my pointer again. Where did that pointer go? There it is. If we look here at the top right, they don't necessarily have an idea about whether silvopasture is more visually appealing. And that's kind of an interesting response because some studies would suggest that savanna systems in general are more appealing to human populations. But I think this may just reflect that they lack experience with silvopastures. But they're also uncertain about how silvopastures might affect management intensity. But one of the interesting points here is that agents seem to view producers as much more averse to adopting intensive management than the producers themselves did. Producers and agents both were generally quite positive about the ability to manage trees, as here in the top left, and forages and livestock together. They also strongly agreed about the need for agricultural system diversity, as represented by these, pink and red, or light red and red bars here. However, they were much less certain about the potential for silvopastures to improve farm profit margins. You see, both groups have these large neither agree nor disagree. And that question of economics is certainly one of the areas that we are interested in and continue to work on, particularly my colleague Greg Fry with the U.S. Forest Service. So again, I think some of the uncertainty that agents and producers reveal in their responses reflects a lack of exposure or training. So in 2013, we started some extension efforts with agents and technical service providers. And at that time, we realized actually that many of the technical service providers had no exposure to silvopastures. And I would say this too, those in the forestry and natural resources communities were often opposed to integrating livestock with forestry. It's kind of interesting, we would have these meetings and we would be talking, you could see if we were in sort of a forested setting, the body language from folks, particularly in the forestry and conservation services end of the equation, they would be, a little more resistant. I'm not so sure about this. And folks on the agricultural side say, oh yeah, maybe we can bring some cows into these trees. If we were in an agricultural setting and we were talking about planting trees into the pasture, well, then the agricultural folks were saying, wait a minute, I'm not so sure about this. And folks on the conservation and forestry side were saying, hey, that doesn't sound like too bad an idea. So it was very interesting. We had a couple of these meetings. We had probably about 100 participants over the two of them. And we took a follow-up survey about 3 months after the training, and it was very rewarding, I guess, or gratifying in that all the respondent participants all the responding participants indicated that the trainings had increased their knowledge and that they could see some potential for the practice. In fact, if you look at that third set of columns, almost 75% of the respondents had spoken with producers about silvopasture after the training, and another 25% indicated that they were already beginning to work with landowners. So the positive feedback we had from that survey reinforced our efforts to create more and better research and demonstration sites. And so from 2013, we have gone from 1 silvopasture research and demonstration site up to 4 today. And we are planning to put another site in place in 2019. And so if you just look here on this map, the one on the lower left, put my pointer on here again. This site is the Kentland research site near the Virginia Tech campus. And then we have planted some more of a demonstration site at the Catawba Sustainability Center. We also have a small demonstration site at the Shenandoah Valley Ag Research and Extension Center. And we have a much larger, so this is about 4 acres at the Shenandoah Valley AREC. And at the Southern Piedmont AREC, we have about a 40-acre demonstration site. And then we'll have about 20 or so acres in a 30-acre set of systems that going in Northern Virginia. So some of the first work that I've mentioned of the research work that we did in Virginia occurred here in Blacksburg near the college. And the young lady here, Alicia Bergler, was conducting work looking at tree species and density and slope effects on forage production and nutritional value. And her results led to what I call my own kind of silvopasture conversion. I was not necessarily all that enthusiastic about putting trees in pasture. When the forester colleague approached me and asked me to do this, I thought, well, nobody wants trees in pastures, but I'm an untenured assistant professor and I need things to work on. So sure, I'll get involved with this. Well, interestingly enough, 2002, Virginia went under water restriction. It was so dry. And in 2003, it was like the tap never turned off. We just had rain all summer. And Alicia found, if you look at this this figure, let me go back to my pointer. Where did it go? Well, I'm not seeing it now. Anyway, if you look at this figure on the left, you have 2002 and 2003 under low tree density. In the middle, we have medium tree density, and on the right, it's high tree density. And so for both of these years, we saw a positive response in forage productivity with moderate shading. There's about a 16% increase, again, over a very dry and a very wet year. And so that was very encouraging to me. And as we have gone along, we recognize that forage responses change as the trees get larger. But this was, encouraging to see this kind of consistent response in different environmental conditions. And it was enough to hook me and really get me going with silvopasture work. So that was one of our early studies. I've also had some work or done some work with Honeylocust, which is a multi-purpose tree. And we have tested pod production and nutritive value particularly or specifically. And people often question me about the use of this tree, but it has a number of potential benefits in terms of multiple uses, its broad adaptation, and its growth, morphology, and phenology are well suited to cool season forage production systems. In effect, it's like a warm season tree, and that complements the growth pattern of cool season forages. And these trees can benefit the system by reducing soil temperatures and evapotranspiration, which has some potential benefit for the forage understory. But we're also thinking about these trees as pod producers. And one of my students, Jacob Johnson, spent his autumns harvesting Honeylocust pods and categorizing the tree productivity. And when we look at these trees, they have an alternate bearing pattern. And so they may go from bearing almost nothing in, say, the year one. The second year, they have kind of a moderate load. And then the third year, if we go back to this picture, you can see him in the pulling the pods out. You know, a heavy bearing year, they can produce enough pods to actually break some of the scaffold branches, at least with this Millwood variety that we've been working with. And so when he was looking at this, you know, over the kind of a 3-year average, these are younger trees, and calculating out on a 40 by 40 spacing, estimated you could yield over 500 pounds of pods per acre. And of course, as these trees grow and mature, this production level is going to increase. The yield of pods gets more interesting to us, however, when we look at the nutritional value of the pods. And while in this table or set of tables, you can look at the fibers and the protein and the pods and the seeds, the main point of the slide is the nutritional value of the whole ground seed pods. And with these, again, these are a ground material, but when we look at that and look at the in vitro digestibility is up at about 83%. You know, this material is comparable to corn, and you know, 500 pounds of corn grain anyway would be about worth $35 or $40 per acre at today's corn prices, and we have people that are renting land for less than that. All right. We've also looked at animal performance and behavior in silvopastures, and this picture is from some of Gabe Pence's research, and you can see some sheep hanging out underneath the black walnut trees. In this particular study, we compared black walnut silvopastures and Honeylocust silvopastures with open pastures, and just for ease of following along, the green represents the open pasture treatments, the black boxes or bars will be black walnut, and the gold will be Honeylocust. And when we look at forage yield over the 3 years of our study, they were routinely lower under black walnut, which likely reflects a more dense shade pattern and some changes in botanical composition. We also did not see a whole lot of difference in nutritional value. Some indication that maybe there's a little higher protein in the shaded treatments, which is not uncommon in the literature, and a little bit of lower fiber in the Honeylocust system, and that probably reflects more red clover in those systems. When we look at actual animal performance, we see that the lambs gained as well or better in the silvopastures as in open pasture systems. And you said, well, wait a minute, you had less forage in the black walnut system, and that's correct. And so we had to adjust stocking rate. So we just want to compare these systems in terms of total gain. And they were equivalent across treatments. Even though we had less forage in the black walnut system, those animals were able to, or they had greater total gain, greater average daily gain, so that total gains among the systems were similar. We also spent some time looking at animal behavior, and those behaviors are very different between systems. If you look first at shade utilization, you see that animals in the silvopastures had the opportunity to stay in the shade. There was some opportunity for animals in the open systems just because of the layout. They did get some shade from the neighboring silvopastures, so whenever they could, they took advantage of the shade. Some of the differences translate, or the The effects on the environment translate into different grazing time. And animals, the animals in the black walnut specifically had a little more, spent a little more time grazing. Animals in the open systems spent less time lying down and more time standing. So these represent energetic expenditures. So that even though forage may say, for example, may have been limiting in the black walnut system, those animals are probably going to be spending a little less time in and energy in standing behaviors. And so that may be part of the reason why that the performance was as good as it was in those systems. Another difference that we were able to measure in these systems, and that is body temperature during the day. The lambs in the open system exhibit greater temperature variation. So again, the open system here, where does that marker go? The open system here is the green line, and you can see that they are hotter during the day, and they get cooler at night, so they have more variability. The animals in the Honeylocust systems, they actually get a little hotter later in the day, and we speculate that this is more a reflection of a bigger meal and the heat of eating and fermentation that comes from that larger meal that they're collecting here late afternoon. Since graduating, Gabe has taken a job at the Southern Piedmont Center, and so the next few slides will show a little bit of the work that's going on there. He's specifically started some work looking at heifer development, and the site where he's working is a 40-acre site that was created from a stand of timber, and that work was originally or was initiated by Dr. Chris Teutsch, a colleague who's now at the University of Kentucky. This 40-acre site was divided into 5 experimental units, and of the 8 units, get my pointer here again, 2 were converted into a hardwood silvopasture, and you can see that this is more of the hardwood side. 2 were converted into a pine silvopasture, and then we had the remaining 4 or the remaining 4 experimental units were clear cut, and the 2 pink ones here were actually planted back to loblolly pine. And there's been some discussion about what that takes to create a silvopasture, both in effort and in costs. And so if you see down here the cost at $1,540 per acre, and that's going to probably be quite high, but the mulching work that was done on this site, which costs about $1,000 an acre, is not necessarily something that would have to be done or would be recommended even. So there are probably more than one ways to skin a cat, and we could spend some more time talking about that if you want to. So this is what the site looked like this past summer, and you can see the pine trees here with lots of shade around the region, and then there's the hardwood system on this side of the road. So when Gabe looked at forage availability this past season, the initial data suggests that forage availability was similar across the different silvopasture systems. The new silvopasture, I guess, would represent the ones where we've planted trees in there, and not a lot of difference there. There were some small differences in nutritional value, and excuse me. The intermediate shade treatments generally were as good or better as the open pasture systems. When we look at heifer gains, they were as good or better in the silvopasture sites. Gabe also had an animal science colleague come in and do some work looking at reproductive tracts, and the reproductive tract scores were similar among treatments. But if we continue to see this pattern play out over time as we get more animal numbers, we may be able to say that moderate shade from the silvopasture was better for animal reproductive performance. Now, I will hold off on making any sort of definitive claim there, but we're working on that. Another student working at the Southern Piedmont, former student Kelly Mercer, evaluated forage yield and composition responses to shade in the Southern Piedmont environment. She used these slatted shade structures that were built with snow fence. There's some data out of South America that indicate that these kind of cages or shade structures create the mottled light environment that's similar to silvopasture, and it allows us to do this with more control and more uniformity than what we might be able to get out of just a typical silvopasture site. And the graph on the lower left, right here, shows that yields were similar between open pastures or open plots and plots with 30% shade. By the time we get to the 50% shade structure, forage yield is starting to decline. These are the 2016 data. The data looks similar for 2015 as well. However, when we look at botanical composition, you see that in that planting year in 2015, where we had complex mixtures, we had far fewer weeds as we got into the shaded environment, and our more desirable species, say for example orchard grass, as we increase shade, we have better performance of those desired species. Looking again in 2016, Kelly found that orchard grass continued to increase in a linear fashion with increasing levels of shade. Tall fescue here, represented by the dots, performed quite well at 30 to 50% shade, but then dropped off in the 70% shading. All right, so I mentioned that we have these 5 research and development or research and demonstration sites at some stage of implementation. And I just want to mention this one site at the Shenandoah Valley AREC quickly. This has largely been used as a demonstration, and my forestry colleagues helped get a degraded site. Actually, there's an old homestead that was in here, and there's a lot of rock in this area, and my colleagues got that site marked, and then it was thinned as part of a larger timber sale at the farm. And our goal with the thinning was to leave about 50 square feet of basal area, and I think this was close, but about 30% of that stand was in green ash, and it has been hit hard by the emerald ash borer. So all the ash trees have come out over the course of this winter. So now we're going to test some establishment methods in the presence of cattle starting this spring, just to see what we will get with that. Some of our future efforts that we're slowly working toward is the development of some 3-dimensional computer modeling. We'd really like to be able to grow, and I use that in quotes, to grow a silvopasture on site. So a farmer can say, okay, here's my soil map, here's my data layers, grow me a silvopasture here. We'd like to be able to grow those in a virtual space so that the land manager or producer could have a better feel for how these systems might look on their site and what the management requirements and the productivity might be over time. So this is a tool that we hope to develop for producers. And so coming back to producers themselves, I want to again kind of round out my talk today, giving some snapshots of silvopasture around the state as implemented by producers, and just to speak a little bit about landowner motivations. This site is owned by a rather wealthy landowner. He's also actually a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, And he planted double rows of loblolly pine. The picture here was taken, I think, about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. And the delegate uses this both for hunting and for beef cattle. And the picture here on the right, there's switchgrass and annual lespedeza that's planted here for wildlife. And the cattle use these sites. The picture over here on the left, there's a lot of stickweed in here, but he's also got a lot of tall fescue. And the delegate said, you know, I think the tall fescue actually benefits from some of that lazy shade, as he calls it, from the trees. The cattle on the sort of the wildlife side of this equation, they utilize that space until it's time for hunting season, and then they're moved on to other parts of the farm. Another producer also working with loblolly pine. This is a thin stand in the Keysville area, and the owner does some forestry work, and he wanted this largely for aesthetics. I don't remember the age of the stand, probably in the 20-year range when he thinned it. It's probably a little bit thick, frankly, for a really productive understory. When it's moist, this site looks very nice. When it's hot and dry, you can see the tree roots pulling the soil moisture down because the grass will not be as green around those trees. But again, he had the capacity to do this, and he thought it looked nice, and he's put this in place, and I think he's been well pleased with it. Heat stress abatement is another reason or rationale for putting these systems in place. And you'll notice this title, it's called Successful Failure. The landowner, Mr. Schwartz, thinned a couple of acres of hardwoods. These are mostly white oak, and you can see we have a lot of epicormic branching at this site. And when the thinning first occurred, those trees responded by growing rapidly, but the stress associated with that has resulted in some greater epicormic branching than would be desirable. And but he didn't really worry about that too much, because he said, look, I've got a place where I can market these trees over time. They've largely gone to railroad ties, but and we used this site. You can see in the left-hand picture, this is where we had one of our first trainings, and so you can imagine all the grumbling from the folks in the Department of Forestry or NRCS saying, well, I don't know, this doesn't look so good. Interestingly, though, Mr. Schwartz is a very astute, and this is the site where he took the comments that he got from us to heart, and he went back and managed, and he looked at the stands that he had, and he got a timber sale out of this, and has worked with consulting forester. Actually, he did the marking, and the consulting forester just went back and said, yeah, this looks good. And so this is a site that we visited as part of the North American Agroforestry Conference Silvopasture pre-conference tour last year. Another site is moving out of the Ridge Valley and back over into the Piedmont. This is a former student of mine, Chris Fields Johnson. Chris was actually working not on silvopastures, but on other research efforts. And you can imagine, as a graduate student, he didn't have a lot of money to lay out for these kinds of systems. There are a lot of acres of pine in Virginia. The forest industry has kind of gotten out of the land owning business. And so a lot of those acres are available for people who might come in a system or a situation like Chris, where they could lease these lands for fairly cheap. Chris has managed with goats and with sheep, and in fact he's kind of gotten rid of the goats because they've taught all his sheep everything his sheep need to know. And he's gone in and thinned and done a lot of that work by hand. He said it's kind of his exercise plan. Used portable fencing in places where there haven't been a lot of infrastructure, And because he can move around on these large spaces, and the goats are kind of, and sheep have been cleaning machines, as it were, that's allowed him to begin to develop the understory pastures. So he was looking at this again for its opportunity in terms of low capital outlay, using small ruminants as a way to clean the system up. He was also doing some environmental restoration. There are some degraded sites on this farm, and I already mentioned his fitness plan with that. Another producer that's working with us is Buck Holsinger. Buck is the recipient of the first NRCS cost share for tree establishment in Virginia. And he has planted hardwoods and pines in Broadway. This is back in the Shenandoah Valley. He's largely done this with the concept of having a two-story agriculture. And he says, you know, look, I could build a barn and let it depreciate, or I could plant trees that provide the same function in terms of shade or shelter, and they grow in value and provide some additional services. So, you know, I've got heat stress abatement. He's planted soft mast trees as well as locusts and hard mast like walnuts and hickories. Looking at the soft mast as a feed resource, persimmons he's planted. He said, I planted persimmons because I like to hunt deer. And he also sees opportunities with these trees as browse material. And in fact, he has some existing black locust trees, which he's, some of them he's cut using a hinge cutting technique, where he would just cut them mostly, but not all the way, so the tree falls over, and then the animals can come in and clean those leaves off the trees. But since the tree's not dead, it can grow back. And so he's been experimenting with that. One of the comments that Buck makes that I think is really interesting, he says, look, it's great for marketing because my customers get it. They understand what I'm trying to do. You know, even if my farmer neighbors think I'm crazy, my customers see the value and benefit of this, and they're all about it. This is kind of Buck's approach. He started out not knowing exactly what he was going to do, and in fact, this picture on the left, this diagram, he said, I started that out with some crayons on some paper. Later, I got a picture of the farm layout and put them in with Sharpie. And this diagram ended up in one of our extension bulletins. And this is Buck talking about some of the efforts that he's had and some of the maintenance challenges actually with some of these systems. Part of his challenge really is that he's an engineer, computer engineer for IBM. And he also is in the Air National Guard. So sometimes when you try to contact him, he may be delivering supplies to Afghanistan or something like that. So he's on the go and not as able to be on site as he might want to be sometimes. The next producer is Milton Napier. Milton is in the Blue Ridge region. And for him, it's a second career. This is Adam. Let's see here. Where did my cursor go? There's my cursor. Adam Downing is a district area forester. Martha Waring here is she is with the Department of Forestry, and interestingly, she was one of those folks who's a little bit skeptical after viewing those hardwood sites at the Swartz farm. But I think she absorbed some of the good out of that and thought, yeah, this can be useful. And Martha came in and worked with Adam to mark the timber on this site. So this is Mr. Napier and Adam Downing again at a field day talking about what's being done to create the silvopastures on the site. We've largely left the yellow poplar in the site. For Mr. Napier, who's retired as a civil servant for the Army, he was an accountant for them. You know, he sees this as a way to improve the land, increase its value, and create an opportunity for intergenerational land transfer. And he's been a great one to work with to demonstrate some of these sites. Now, I mentioned earlier that some landowners who have maybe a little better wherewithal may be more interested in adopting silvopasture. And this producer is Todd Repass, who's in Southwest Virginia. And Todd is an engineer for the Department of Transportation, and he was looking for something different. And so we'll talk about his engineer's mentality. He went out and laid everything off in straight lines, and you can see this is kind of where, let's get my arrow back. Where did you go, arrow? You can see he laid everything off in straight lines here, and you can see now what that site looks like from above. These are a little grayer because he's fenced those out. But then in the fall, you can see what he's got largely Jersey mothers for some of the beef calves that he's got in his system. He told me that he opened this up this fall and was pleased that the cows weren't doing much in the way of damage. This site's been in place for about 3 years now, I think. Todd has done this pretty much all on his own, but again, it's something that's different and unique. He said his son said, Dad, this is going to look really cool. So I think he's been happy to get the response from his children that way. And I think, one of the things interesting about Todd, he said, when I first started talking about this, people think, yeah, this is crazy. But, as I was working with my fertilizer co-op, they started seeing, well, what's it going to take for us to be able to get trucks in and out for any sort of fertilization or herbicide treatments or that sort of thing. And he worked with the local area forester, extension foresters, and others. And they could, as they began to work together, again, kind of this team concept, they could see how this thing could work. And so, again, we're kind of on the early stages of this, but Todd is another producer who's been, very happy to open up his place and tell, the good, bad, and the ugly about the whole system. This next site, this is a picture of Dana Beagle. Dana and her husband run several businesses, including restaurant efforts and mobile sort of food truck sort of stuff, I think, that sort of thing. And they were very interested in species and product diversity on their farm and in wetland protection. They also were working with the local FFA group because they're very interested in community engagement. And so that gave them an opportunity for that. This is another farm in Southwest Virginia. I've been kind of random in how I present these to you. This site is in Madison, Virginia. It's again part of the Piedmont near the Blue Ridge, and the landowner Robert Bradford has kind of thinned trees out as he could by himself. This was a 100% stand. I think he took out every other row, and then he started taking out trees within rows, and he's just taking them out over time and sort of as need be and getting forages back in, and largely for heat stress abatement. Robert also has some hardwood plantings, but many people in Central Virginia will be working with loblolly pine, and so that's a good option for them. Another person working with loblolly pine a little further east, a little hotter environment, said, well, look, I'm not going to do this kind of thinning stuff. I'm in a row to row sort of thing. And he just created wide alleys and left tree rows that would be two, generally, sometimes 3 rows of trees wide. And again, this is largely for heat stress abatement and some for timber management. Although we're uncertain exactly how this is going to work out on the timber management side. Mr. Poindexter says, I like the look of it. He said, but that's not necessarily my primary motivating factor. The next site that I've got for you, this is, or I guess kind of a concluding statement, not really, is we have diverse people who have diverse resources and they have diverse motivations. Animal welfare is a driving factor for most of our producers. Timber management is important for many. Many of them say that they're interested in diversity, and that kind of goes back to the comments that we got out of surveys that producers and agents see the addition of trees as a good way to add biodiversity to their landscapes. Some are interested in growing value. Land transfer is and opportunities for intergenerational transfer is important. And the aesthetics and marketing are all seem to be considered by these producers, although they're not necessarily their first motivation. For those of you who are interested, we do have some extension resources. We have a website at Virginia Tech on the Silvopasture website. And on that website, you can go to the Publications tab, and you can find these 3 extension publications. There are also some popular press articles that are along the same lines of these, but these are probably the best resources that we have. One to define silvopastures, another talking about how we would create silvopastures when thinning existing timber stands, and the third one being on considerations when planting trees into pastures. And that's where I'm going to leave it with my talk, as it were, and I'll be happy to entertain questions. I did get a set of questions from Greg earlier today. Let's see if I can get back to my email.
Well,
and I'll just
that might be one approach. Just to let folks know that, we will have a question and answer session. We have time for that. I'm going to open up a question and answer box. While John, you're reviewing some of those questions that were sent in by participants before the presentation. Let me open up a question and answer box, and so that the folks, participants here, can begin sending in any questions. As you can see, this question and answer box. Go ahead and send any questions or comments. Best not to use the chat box on the off to the side, but this Q&A box right here in the middle of the screen. John, if you've got any questions you want to tackle from the ones that were previously sent in, go ahead. Otherwise, I've got a question or two for you.
Well, I'm just going to run through these questions that you sent me, if that's all right, just to make sure that they get covered. What do I feel is the main obstacle to adoption of agroforestry practices at this time? Well, I mean, I tried to hit on that. I think there are a number of cultural barriers, both from within the ag production community as well as from conservation communities. I also think there are still a number of questions about the economics of these systems. But again, I think people's lack of experience or exposure to these systems is a big impediment that we're working to address. I have the graduate student, and he's a graduate student and extension agent that conducted the survey of agents. He often talks about or uses no-till crop production as an apt metaphor for this, because no-till practices took a long time to be adopted, and a lot of that required people to retire so that the next generation could come on and do it, since the old generation had always done it with tillage, and maybe it needed time for equipment to wear out and people to try new approaches too for the no-till. But he sees similar parallels. It takes a period of time for producers to learn and understand and become comfortable and familiar with these systems. And again, in this situation, we're talking not only the producer community, but we're also thinking in terms of that kind of familiarity and comfort within the conservation communities as well. Another one was, can I address the applicability of silvopasture in northern hardwood forest types? And I would say yes, very applicable there. The management practices may need to be different depending on what tree species you're working with, because many of the northern hardwoods are likely going to have more shade, but if they have a lot of hickory or something like that, then you've got a morphology or phenology that fits better for those systems. And I know that folks like Joe Reffiche and Jomi are doing work with these types of systems in the Northeast and the northern reaches of the Midwest. And so I think that there are opportunities there, although how they get managed will certainly be different than what we might do in Virginia. Somebody else said, what about reclamation of abandoned pasture or eradication of invasive species? And what are the tools and the costs? And I don't know that I can lay out tools and costs because I think that they depend, there's a wide array there. For that sort of abandoned site that we used at the Shenandoah Valley AREC, we had somebody come in and mulch after the timber that was there, the timber that we wanted harvested. After that was taken in, they came in and mulched. The guy who did that suggested maybe you should have mulched before. Then it would have been easy for the folks doing the timber clearing to get in and get out of there more readily. And that was not a big mulcher. That was more like a little flail on the front end of a bobcat. I view silvopasture as a way or an opportunity to eradicate or reclaim land that has gone back and been lost to a number of invasive species. But that's going to probably require herbicide or the use of small ruminants or maybe both. But I think that there are a lot of opportunities to use some abandoned pasture or abandoned woodlands for either abandoned pasture or abandoned woodlands to create silvopasture. And I guess the point that I want to make, and I often show a slide showing what silvopasture is not. I think it's very important that when we take that approach with these lands, that we don't do what was done generations ago and just fence it out, or fence around it and dump the livestock in there. These systems require management, and if we're going to bring them back from a degraded state, they're going to probably require additional management over what we might give for existing pasture, obviously. But kind of the promise of that is that we're getting something back out of these lands, and we're putting management back in place in a way that's going to make that land more productive than it is when it's just left as abandoned pasture or degraded woodlots. I understand this is focused more on the Midwest, but if there are any California-based resources to share, I'd greatly appreciate it. I don't know that I have a lot of California resources. There was some work done by Frost and McDougall in the annual grasslands under blue oak, and so some of that has been done there, but I don't know that there's a lot of effort on that at this point. And if you want to follow up with me later, Daniel, I'll do what I can to help you on that one. Recommendations on pest management. And this question, I'm not quite sure. It says teaks and bats, and I'm not sure what the. I think that must be ticks and bats, and I don't know what the bat issue would be. In fact, probably I would think bats would be a good thing in many cases. Ticks. Yeah, we haven't really worried about ticks with our sheep, and I don't have any real feedback for you in terms of cattle that we've got out of that on the southern Piedmont. And I know there are a number of treatments for ticks and lice and such that might be used, say, around mineral feeders or something like that, so that you could use some sort of acaricide to get rid of those, but or acaricide, arachnicide, however you would say that. But I don't know that I have a good answer. How important is biochar apt to be in agroforestry about 5 years from now? That's a question I'm really not prepared to address. What is the aerial extent of silvopastoral systems in Virginia, the U.S., and globally? Well, if we went back and looked at some of those original numbers that I had from the southeast, where about, what was that, 0.12% of farms in the U.S. or 0.18% of farms in the southeast were using some sort of agroforestry practice. Aerially, 0.12, 0.18, 0.2% would be not much. And I don't have an answer for you on a global scale. As far as hands-on workshops, we do do some of that, if you're in the Virginia area and you want to come, be happy to keep you apprised. You can just shoot me an email. Do we have any information on forage quality improvements using silvopasture? And do you have any farmers who would be willing to serve as mentors for aspiring folks? And I would say, yeah, I think we have some farmers that many of those folks that I mentioned today, I think would be happy to provide whatever knowledge or experience that they've had. And as far as forage quality, again, that kind of depends on compositional changes. We sometimes see some benefits. Sometimes, depending on tree species, you may see some sort of decline. But when you put the combination of shade for animals and what that means in terms of changes in behavior and heat stress, that can offset that so that we have similar levels of productivity or sometimes even more. Here's a question about, or statement about, grazing cattle in woodlands. And again, the issue there is these need to be managed systems, so I don't think about it as just kind of dumping cattle out. And the question of ratio of cattle to acres. So I'm thinking about this in terms of a rotational management, and I don't think about this so much in terms of numbers of livestock per unit of acres, or per acres. In Virginia, it's not uncommon for folks with cow-calf systems to have, say, 2.5 cows per acre as kind of their carrying capacity. But that's going to vary by site and management. And in this context, I prefer to think in terms of using rotational management and grazing that forage when it's ready to be grazed and moving those animals out when you reach, say, a certain residual height, like, say, maybe 3 inches residual height, or maybe even a little bit higher in the silvopasture system. So I think of it more from the standpoint of grass management as opposed to just some gross, I got 3 acres, I can put a cow in there. Mark asks, are you aware of any silvopasture work being done with shagbark hickory? You might check with Jomi or Joe or Refache in those more northeast systems. We have some intention of creating, at the Claremont, we have some intention of actually planting some hickory as part of sort of a mast system. That's likely also going to include some walnut and some northern red oak, maybe some white oak, and some hybrid American chestnut. And we think that these systems may be an opportunity to bring back, or as a way to help bring back the American chestnut. The producer, Buck Holsinger, that I mentioned, he also has, I think, planted some hickory, or at least he's planted northern pecan, which is in the hickory family. Eli Roberts, you mentioned mulching at the Piedmont site represented a large part of the establishment cost, but said maybe that wasn't necessary. What are your thoughts on dealing with tops and branches from the thin trees? So my thoughts, one way to manage that, if you had small ruminants or even cattle, if you may be that you could leave that stuff in place. It's going to kind of depend on your timing, but you may leave it in place and let livestock eat the green on that when it's cut, if you've got it fenced and can get in there. Another option may be to push it into piles that are strategically located and burn them. I will say this, don't burn, this is based on experience, don't burn too close to the trees you want to leave. But I think that, some of that stuff can weather and will degrade fairly rapidly depending on the size of it. Larger pieces, I would suggest cutting that up for cordwood. If you've got people that are burning firewood, that would be a way to deal with some of that. Again, it's going to it's going to depend on your available resources. It may be that you've got somebody with one of these smaller scale mulchers. The mulching that was done at the Southern Piedmont, they actually mulched like an inch or two into the soil, and they were trying to incorporate and clean all of that up. And that's nice for research and demonstration, that looks pretty, but from a practical application standpoint, maybe you're well heeled and you want to do it that way, that's fine. I'm not against that, but I think for people who are thinking in terms of, how do I make money here, they're probably not going to take that approach. Um, okay, Michael Cooley. I know from seeing Dr. Pent's presentation at NAC, livestock seem to be happier with some shade. Any research as to meat quality with lower heat stress? Michael, I had another student who did some work with some sheep earlier than Dr. Pent on the same site, and we really didn't see a lot of evidence of shade effects on those lambs. However, I think part of that may have been the fact that the animals grazed on into the fall, and so maybe they were not coming out of the system at a point when they had been heat stressed for a long period of time. There may also be some acclimation that's involved in that too. So sometimes we see a little better response to the shade earlier in our studies, and they can kind of acclimate. Of course, as you get later into the season, things cool down some too. So there are a number of factors there. But we have not seen, in our limited research, we have not seen much evidence of that. I do know that heat stress is associated with lower meat quality for animals on feedlots and that sort of thing. So I would anticipate that would hold in this situation as well. But again, it's going to depend on things like when do those animals go to harvest. Any studies with oak and hickory trees? I think I've kind of mentioned that we're on the front end of getting some of that established and won't really have good data for you about that for some time to come. Nitin Pandit, can you discuss findings about silvopasture for restoration of degraded lands, particularly reinforcing the soil microbiota? I don't have an answer for that one, Nitin. I've got a colleague who's a soil microbiologist, and I have actually wanted him to go out and look with me at the silvopasture sites that we have here with black walnut and honeylocust, and we just haven't gotten that done. From the standpoint of reinforcing or restoring degraded lands, I think that's a great question. One of the things that's of interest to me, if we think about planting trees into existing pastures, you're thinking about systems that are kind of microbially driven or bacterially driven in a pasture ecosystem, and you've got trees that are, typically associated with mycorrhiza and more fungally driven systems. And so I have wondered, how well do trees change the microbiota when we put those back into a pasture setting? And it may be that we can do work with certain inocula or that sort of thing, but that gets pretty complicated, and it's not something that I've got any real experience with. Are slides used today available for further review by today's participants? Mike, I guess I think you said that that's going to be up, that this presentation will be up later, so
yes. Well, this presentation is recorded, so anyone can navigate to the Center for Agroforestry.org website, click on the webinar tab, and you'll see all previous webinars and can view them. So you have access to see the slides. I guess, John, whether people could have access to the actual slides, that would depend on you, and we can follow up about that later and see if that's something that you're. Yeah.
Right. I guess I'd like to entertain the question. Let's put it that way. But I'm generally pretty open to sharing. Mike, the other question: do I know of any research being done on accidental consumption of pine needles by beef cattle during grazing related to health? I think that ponderosa pine has been associated with some abortions, but ponderosa pine, pine needle consumption has been associated with some abortions for cattle out in the West. I have looked for some of that information from the Southeast and really haven't seen any of that. I wouldn't say that it's not possible or doesn't happen, but I have not found any literature to indicate that would be the case under, say, a loblolly type system. And we have a long history of people grazing cattle under loblolly or slash pine in the southern coastal plain states, and none of that has indicated any evidence of that as a problem from what I have seen. I did have a colleague at the University of Florida wonder about that. She thought she had lost some animals and it might have been due to that. But again, there are producers in Florida using loblolly and not seeing that problem. It could be, different species. I don't really know all the details, but generally, I would say I think these systems are safe for livestock in the South.
All right, John, I think we're running over time here. There are a few questions, as you see in the chat box there. Maybe if there's one or two of those that you'd want to quickly address.
Okay, sure. Yeah, okay, so Julianne says, does size of property make a difference? If you're thinning, Julianne, the answer to that is yes. If your goal is, or if you need to have a forester come in and you have just a couple of acres, they'll be asking you how much you want to pay for that, as opposed to telling you how much they're going to give you for it. So scale is an important factor. For those people who can do some of this work on their own, scale becomes less important, but realizing an economic return on smaller scale gets harder to do. And I have that, that's indicated in the extension publication that we have on thinning. And, again, many of these producers are putting these in a few acres at a time. They're, many of them are less worried about the value of the tree. They're thinking about the other goods and services the tree can provide besides just timber. Steve Gabriel says, what were the sample sizes for each of the groups interviewed? We had about 139 extension agents, I think, and they were all from, Virginia, I think some maybe from West Virginia, Kentucky, South Carolina, Georgia, primarily. I don't remember if we had Tennessee or North Carolina, but they were mostly from within the Southeast. And the predominant, or the largest group would have been agents from Virginia. The producer group, we had 40 limited resource producers from, largely from Central Virginia that were involved in that survey. Chris Carney says, is Virginia Tech doing anything with white oak and silvopasture setting with the intention of producing stave quality logs, trainer species to grow with white oak to minimize or prevent future epicormic branching in a 3-row design, stakes and staves? Yeah, JB, I don't know what I said, but I think that's what I meant, was 2.5 acres per cow. Thank you. So, sorry, Chris, going back to your question, we have planted white and northern red, not so much thinking about stake and stave per se, but thinking about these trees as potential mast trees as well as potential timber trees. And I mentioned the mast system that we're considering implementing in 2019 up in Northern Virginia. In those systems, we have planted with different, for the demonstration site, this is at the Catawba Sustainability Center in Southwest Virginia. We have planted with different types of conifers and also with some yellow poplar, looking at those as trainer trees and using different distances off of the tree row just to kind of see how that will work. And there have been large differences actually in the success of the different trainer tree species. I could go into that further. I won't bore the group with all those details at this point. But we are making some efforts to look at that over time.
No, I think that's it. I think we managed to, I think, cover all the questions. I don't see any other additional questions that have come in. I think with that, John, you also touched on the couple of questions I had in responding. I had thought to follow up about the mulching and so appreciate that. So I think at this point we can close the session, and I'm going to thank you, John, for an excellent presentation and for sticking around for an extended Q&A session. So, and thanks to all the folks who joined us today and managed to finally get into the webinar room despite a glitch with the URL there. So thank you for your patience and apologies for the inconvenience. This is the Agroforestry in Action webinar series. Today's presentation has been recorded and will be posted on the Center for Agroforestry.org website. You can access it clicking on the webinar tab there and view it as well as all other previous webinar presentations in this series. And check that Center for Agroforestry.org website for information and schedules for upcoming presentations. So thanks again to everyone for being with us. Thank you, John. Join us next month for Maria Rosa Mosquera Lozada. We'll be talking about agroforestry in the European context and an update from the European Agroforestry Association. That will be on April 18th. So thanks again to everyone. See you next time. Bye-bye now.